This monitor is more expensive than any computer I've plugged into it. This is the ProArt PA32UCG, and it's the best monitor ASUS has to offer so far. I do not have the finalized pricing for this, but the previous monitor in this series costed $4,400 and had lower performance, so I do not imagine this to cost any less. However, for the performance it offers, its price range is still very likely to be considered a bargain. For reference, here's the price of an HDR monitor you might find on a high-end film set, which actually underperforms this monitor we've got here in quite a number of key aspects. For starters, this has got a peak brightness of 1600 nits and has a sustained full screen brightness of 1000 nits. That actually surpasses the ITU's recommendations for critical viewing of HDR content, which only requires a peak brightness of 1000 nits. That being said, it actually makes a lot of sense being a grading monitor, since a colorist might have to display a particularly bright frame for extended amounts of time as they're working on it, so while short bursts of high brightness might be sufficient for consumer HDR displays, being able to sustain it indefinitely is surely much appreciated by professional users. At this point, I should point out that this video is really more of a show and tell of a monitor I cannot afford to buy and not an in-depth review. I actually borrowed this monitor from ASUS just to film my HDR explained video, but throughout the course of that, I was so impressed by how much of a beast this monitor is, I decided to make this video to share my admiration for it. This 32UCG is using mini LED technology with 1152 local dimming zones. You'll still come across a bit of blooming or halo at times, but for mini LED, there's really not much you can do about it. Plus, when you think about it, 1152 dimming zones is actually substantially more than what's offered in Apple's Pro Display XDR. That comes in at only 576 zones. This also has a much higher refresh rate than any HDR monitor in its class. It can show 4K HDR at 120 Hertz. In true 10-bit. Now 10-bit is a huge deal when you are working in HDR because you're essentially stretching a finite number of data values thinner to achieve that wide of a dynamic range. So the only way around that is to add more data values, hence 10-bit. If you need a refresher on bit depths, check out this video of mine. But a 120 Hz HDR monitor of this brightness, I believe, is unprecedented. And to drive this monitor to its full potential, you've got to do it through its HDMI 2.1 port to handle that incredible bandwidth. The secondary input is an HDMI 2.0, along with your options of DisplayPort and Thunderbolt 3. And yes, it's a pricey, heavy 32-inch chunk of a monitor. Look how its base is already the size of my 16-inch MacBook, but it's also so many things you would ever want in a monitor. Wide P3 color gamut, 4K UHD resolution, thin bezels, support for HDR10, HLG, and even Dolby Vision, plus 1600 nits of peak luminance. To give you an idea of how bright 1600 nits is, a 27-inch iMac maxes out at around 500 nits, and when I actually measured the 32UCG using my light meter, it would appear the monitor actually outperformed its spec sheet, occasionally shooting up to 1900 nits. HDR content simply looks breathtaking on this display. That's something I unfortunately won't be able to show you through a YouTube video, it's something you have to experience in person. At the end of the day, you can say it's just a screen with a fancy spec sheet, but it's a fancy spec sheet that you can actually see the results of. If you're not quite sure what this whole deal around HDR video is about, feel free to check out my HDR explained video, and until then, I'll begin sadly packing this monitor up to be returned to ASUS.